The air in the village of Upper Slaughter always seemed to hold a memory of frost, even when the July sun beat relentlessly against the honey-coloured Cotswold stone. For Elara Vance, the heat was a distant rumour, something that happened to other people in other lives. She moved through the narrow corridors of her cottage with a quiet, practiced precision, her footsteps muffled by thick woolen rugs that she refused to put away. To Elara, the world was a series of sharp edges and cold surfaces, a landscape of permanent midwinter that had settled into the marrow of her bones 3 years ago and simply never vacated the premises. She stood by the leaded window of her kitchen, watching a single bumblebee batter itself against the glass. It was a frantic, vibrating thing, desperate for the lavender scent drifting from the garden, yet barred by a barrier it couldn't comprehend. Elara felt a strange kinship with the insect. She, too, lived behind a glass wall transparent enough to see the vibrancy of life, but thick enough to ensure she never had to feel its warmth. The kettle began its low, rhythmic thrum. It was the only sound in the house, a domestic heartbeat that anchored her to the present. She reached for a willow pattern cup, her fingers tracing the blue curves of the bridge and the birds. She wondered if the lovers on the porcelain ever tired of their static chase, frozen in a moment of eternal pursuit, never reaching the other side, never touching, but also never losing one another. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a gate creaking a rusty, high-pitched protest that sliced through the afternoon stillness. It was the garden gate, the one she had ignored since the hinges had started to fail. Through the window, she saw a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, dressed in a faded linen shirt that clung to his shoulders, and he carried a toolbox with the casual ease of someone who understood the weight of things. This was Julian Thorne. He had been sent by the parish council to fix the fences along the bridle path that bordered her property. A task she had half-heartedly agreed to months ago in a moment of uncharacteristic social compliance. Elara watched him from the shadows of her kitchen. He didn't look like a man who carried a winter inside him. He moved with a loose-limbed grace, his sun-browned arms moving rhythmically as he assessed the broken latch. He paused, looking up at the house, and for a second, Elara felt a jolt of panic. She stepped back, deeper into the gloom, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was a physical sensation she hadn't felt in years, a sudden, sharp intrusion of the external world. She waited for the feeling to subside, for the ice to reform, but the sun was hitting the glass at an angle now, casting long, golden fingers across her linoleum floor. Days bled into a week. Julian returned every morning, his presence a constant, low-frequency hum on the edge of her consciousness. He didn't knock, he didn't intrude, he simply worked. He mended the gate, then the fence, and then, without being asked, he began to clear the brambles that had choked the life out of her rose bushes. From her upstairs window, Elara watched the transformation. She saw the way he handled the plants, not with the aggressive shears of a gardener, but with a strange, attentive tenderness. He seemed to be listening to the garden, deciphering the silent language of overgrown stems and suffocated soil. One afternoon, the heat became unbearable even within the thick stone walls. The air was thick and syrupy, smelling of cut grass and drying nectar. Elara found herself standing by the back door, her hand hovering over the iron handle. The internal monologue that usually dictated her days, a litany of not yet and not ever, stuttered. She pushed the door open. The heat hit her like a physical weight, a soft, heavy blanket that smelled of the earth's deep exhales. She stepped onto the stone patio, her eyes squinting against the brilliance of the light. Julian was there, kneeling by the flower bed, his back to her. He was humming something low and tuneless, a sound that felt like it belonged to the buzzing of the bees. "The soil is exhausted," he said, not turning around. He spoke as if they were in the middle of a conversation that had been going on for years. "It's been holding its breath for too long. It needs to be turned. Let the air in." Elara stayed by the door, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "It's just dirt," she whispered, her voice sounding thin and brittle in the expansive afternoon. Julian turned then. His eyes were the colour of river water, shifting between green and grey, and they held a terrifying amount of clarity. He didn't look at her with the pity she had grown accustomed to from the villagers, the poor Mrs. Vance look that made her feel like a specimen under glass. He looked at her as if she were simply another part of the landscape that had been neglected. "It's never just dirt," he said gently. He held out a handful of dark, crumbly earth. "It's history, it's potential. Everything that's ever died is in here, waiting to become something else. That's the trick of it, isn't it? Nothing really leaves, it just changes state." Elara felt a hairline fracture appear in the ice around her heart. It was a terrifying sensation, a phantom pain like blood returning to a numbed limb. She wanted to retreat, to bolt the door and pull the heavy curtains, but her feet seemed rooted to the stone. "I don't want anything to change," she said, her voice trembling. Julian stood up, brushing the soil from his knees. He walked toward her, stopping just outside the boundary of her personal space. He smelled of pine resin and sweat and the honesty of hard work. "Change is the only thing that's honest, Elara. The wind is blowing from the south today. Can you feel it?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to say she felt nothing but the familiar, safe vacuum of her own grief. But as she stood there, a sudden gust swept up the hill, carrying with it the scent of wild thyme and the distant, shimmering heat of the valley. It caught the loose strands of her hair, tugging at them, and for the first time in 3 years, Elara felt the sun on her face. It wasn't a gentle warmth, it was searing. It felt like an accusation. It told her that the world had continued to turn, that the seasons had cycled without her permission, and that the man she had lost was no longer in the cold ground, but had become part of this very wind, this very soil. She began to cry. It wasn't the quiet, dignified weeping she did in the dark. It was a violent, racking sob that tore through her, a tectonic shift of her internal geography. She sank to the stone steps, her head in her hands, the decades of repressed summer finally bursting through the permafrost. Julian didn't touch her. He didn't offer hollow platitudes or a handkerchief. He simply sat on the step below her, a silent, steady presence, a lightning rod for her storm. He sat there until the sobs turned to gasps, and the gasps turned to the long, shuddering breaths of exhaustion. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruises of violet and gold. The shadows of the lime trees stretched across the lawn like long, elegant fingers. "I thought if I stayed cold, I wouldn't have to feel how much I missed him," Elara whispered, her voice raw. "I thought the ice would preserve the memory, but it just froze me instead." Julian looked out over the valley, where the first few lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance. "Ice doesn't preserve life, Elara, it just pauses it, and while it's paused, you're missing the way the light hits the hills in the evening. You're missing the way the roses smell when they're about to bloom. He wouldn't have wanted you to be a museum for him." He stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. "The gate is fixed," he said. "It swings easily now. You should try using it." He walked away, fading into the gloaming, leaving behind only the smell of turned earth and the sound of the wind in the trees. Elara remained on the steps for a long time. The air was cooling, but the stone beneath her still held the heat of the day. She looked at her hands. They were stained with the dark soil Julian had left on the step. She didn't wipe it off. She stood up, her legs feeling heavy but certain. She walked to the rose bushes, the ones Julian had cleared of thorns. There, nestled deep within the green, was a single, tight bud, its edges tinged with a deep, defiant crimson. It wasn't open yet, but it was reaching. She closed her eyes and took a breath. The air was no longer a threat, it was a conversation. The summer wind blew through the garden, carrying the ghosts of the past and the whispers of the future, and for the first time, Elara Vance didn't shiver. She simply stood in the light, waiting for the bloom. The internal silence that had defined her for so long was no longer a void. It was a space, a room that had been aired out after a long, stifling winter. She thought of Julian's hands, stained with the same earth she now carried under her fingernails, and she realized that the thawing wasn't an end, but a messy, painful, beautiful beginning. She walked to the gate that now moved without protest. She placed her hand on the latch. It felt warm. She pushed it open and stepped out onto the bridle path. The grass was tall and silvered by the rising moon. The world was vast. The world was terrifyingly bright. And as the summer wind wrapped around her, Elara felt the last of the ice crack, dissolve and flow away, leaving behind nothing but the fertile, aching possibility of the light. The bridle path was a ribbon of bruised silver under the burgeoning moon, winding through the throat of the valley like a secret whispered between the hills. Elara Vance walked with a gait that felt alien to her, a rhythmic thrumming of muscle and bone that she had long ago relegated to the status of a machine's ticking. For 3 years, her body had been a vessel for ghosts, a heavy, porcelain thing she carried from room to room with the delicacy of a mourner at a wake. But tonight, the air against her skin felt like a confrontation. It was thick with the scent of damp bracken and the sharp, metallic tang of the coming dew, pressing into her pores, demanding she acknowledge the reality of her own lungs. She reached the old stone bridge that spanned the Larkspur River, a narrow, churning artery that fed the thirsty meadows of Malmesbury Cross. She stopped, leaning her weight against the moss-slicked parapet, her fingers tracing the rough topography of the lichen. Below, the water was a chaotic symphony of shadows, breaking over the jagged stones in a frantic rush to find the sea. It occurred to her then, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that the river had never stopped. While she had sat in the drawing room of Blackwood Rise, watching the dust motes dance in shafts of frozen light, the larkspur had been carving its way through the earth, indifferent to her stillness. It was a terrifying thought, the world's profound indifference to her sorrow. She looked down at her hands. The soil Julian Thorne had left on the steps now dried into the fine lines of her palms. It looked like the delta of a river, a map of some new, unexplored territory. Julian. The man was an enigma of silence and calloused skin, a creature of the earth who seemed to view her not as a tragic figure, but as a neglected plot of land that simply required the right kind of tilling. He hadn't looked at her with the pity she had grown to expect, the tilted head, the softened voice, the way people in the village would cross the street to avoid the contagion of her grief. He had looked at her as if she were a gate with a rusted hinge, something that could be fixed. Her mind drifted back to Arthur. It was an act of bravery now, to let his name surface without the immediate anchor of a sob. Arthur Vance had been a man of books and quiet certainties, a professor of history who preferred the dead to the living because the dead were finished. They didn't change their minds or break their promises. He had loved the winter, the way the frost turned the world into a monochrome photograph. When he died, it felt only natural to follow him into that stillness. She had built a mausoleum out of her own life, convinced that by remaining cold, she was being faithful. But as the wind tugged at her shawl, a sudden, sharp memory pierced the gloom. Arthur, in the height of their first summer, laughing as he spilled a bottle of chilled cider on his white linen shirt, the golden liquid soaking through to his skin. He hadn't been a statue, he had been heat and spills and loud, messy laughter. "I am so tired of being cold, Arthur," she whispered to the river. The words were small, swallowed instantly by the rush of the water, but they felt monumental. They were a confession of treason against the state of her own misery. The walk back to Blackwood Rise felt shorter than the walk out. The house loomed on the hillside, a sprawling Victorian pile of grey flint and dark timber, but it no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a house structure of stone and glass that required maintenance. She let herself in through the kitchen door, the heavy oak swinging on the hinges Julian had oiled that afternoon. There was no screech, no protest. The silence that greeted her was different now. It wasn't the silence of a vacuum, but the quiet of a house that was breathing. She didn't turn on the electric lights. Instead, she lit a single beeswax candle and sat at the scrubbed pine table. The flame flickered in the draught, casting long, dancing shadows against the dresser where her grandmother's willow pattern plates stood in stoic rows. She watched the wax melt, a slow, viscous slide toward the base of the brass holder. It was a transformation, solid to liquid. That night, for the first time in 1,000 nights, she did not dream of the funeral. She did not dream of the black silk umbrella or the smell of lilies that had made her feel faint. Instead, she dreamt of greener violent, emerald green that surged up from the floorboards, vines twisting around the legs of the piano, flowers bursting through the cracks in the ceiling. She dreamt of the house being reclaimed by the woods, and in the dream, she wasn't afraid, she was relieved. Morning arrived with a softness that felt like a peace offering. The light was a pale primrose yellow, filtering through the heavy velvet curtains she had kept drawn for years. Elara stood by the window and, with a trembling hand, pulled the cords. The curtains parted with a heavy sigh, releasing a cloud of dust that shimmered in the air. Outside, the garden was a riot of untamed growth, but there, near the old sundial, was Julian. He was already at work, his back to the house. He was scything the long grass near the orchard, the rhythmic swish thud of the blade providing a heartbeat for the morning. He moved with a brutal elegance, his shoulders working in a slow, steady arc. There was no wasted motion. He was clearing the way for something new, or perhaps just revealing what had been there all along. Elara dressed with a strange sense of purpose. She chose a dress of cornflower blue, a colour she hadn't worn since the accident, and tied her hair back with a ribbon. She felt exposed, as if she were walking out into the world without her armour, but the sensation was not entirely unpleasant. It was a tingling, a return of circulation to a limb that had fallen asleep. She walked out into the garden, the grass wet with dew against her leather shoes. Julian didn't stop his work as she approached, but he acknowledged her with a slight tilt of his head. "The orchard has been hidden for too long," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air. "The apple trees are choked with ivy. It's a wonder they're still standing." Elara looked at the trees gnarled, ancient things that looked like they were being strangled by the dark, glossy vines. "Will they fruit again?" she asked, her voice sounding steadier than she felt. Julian stopped then, leaning his scythe against his leg. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand, his eyes the colour of wet slate fixing on hers. "Trees are stubborn things, Mrs. Vance. They want to live. You cut back the ivy, you give them a bit of light and some feed. And they'll remember what they're meant to do. It might take a season or two, but the life is still in there. It's just waiting for the weight to be lifted." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rusted pair of shears, offering them to her. "The lavender by the path needs deadheading. It's a simple job. Just snip off the grey bits to let the purple come through." Elara hesitated. The shears looked heavy, their blades notched with age. To take them was to accept a contract, a pact with the living world. She looked at Julian, seeing the dirt under his fingernails and the steady, unblinking honesty in his gaze. He wasn't offering her a hobby, he was offering her a way back. She took the shears. The metal was cold, but it warmed quickly in her grip. "I don't know if I remember how to do this," she admitted, a sudden wave of vulnerability washing over her. "The plants know," Julian said, turning back to his scythe. "You just have to follow their lead." She spent the morning on her knees by the lavender. It was a meditative, punishing task. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of her neck, and the scent of the crushed herbs rose up in a fragrant cloud, dizzying and sharp, Each snip of the shears felt like a small liberation. She was removing the dead, the brittle, the exhausted. She was making room. Her mind, usually a carousel of what-ifs and if-onlys, began to quiet. She wasn't thinking about the car on the rain-slicked road or the silence of the hospital corridor. She was thinking about the angle of the stem, the tension of the blade, the way the lavender seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the grey stalks fell away. She was in the present, a place she hadn't visited in years. By noon, her hands were stained and her knees were damp, but there was a strange, humming energy in her limbs. Julian had moved to the far end of the orchard, his figure a dark silhouette against the vibrant green. She watched him for a moment, wondering about the life he led when he wasn't taming the wildness of her estate. Did he have a wife who waited for him in a cottage with a thatched roof? Did he have children who climbed those broad shoulders, or was he like her, a person shaped by the things he had lost, finding solace in the silent, predictable cycles of the earth? She stood up, stretching her aching back, and looked out toward the village of Malmesbury Cross. The spire of the church rose above the trees, a finger of stone pointing toward a sky that was now a deep, unapologetic blue. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to go there. Not to the churchyard to visit the headstone, but to the high street, to the butcher, the baker, the world of mundane transactions and idle chatter. "Julian," she called out. He stopped his work, turning toward her. "I'm going into the village," she said, the words feeling like a triumph. Julian nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "The walk will do you good. The air is clear today." As she walked down the drive, she didn't look back at the house. She focused on the feeling of the gravel under her shoes and the way the shadows of the oaks played across the path. When she reached the gate she had pushed open the night before, she paused. She touched the wood, the grain smooth and silvered by time. She thought of how many times she had stayed behind this gate, convinced that safety lay in seclusion. She pushed it open. It moved with a grace that felt like an invitation. Malmesbury Cross was exactly as she had left it, and yet it felt entirely different. The high street was a narrow artery of honey-coloured stone, the shop fronts painted in muted greens and deep burgundies. It was a Saturday, and the air was filled with the sounds of a community in motion, the chime of shop bells, the low thrum of engines, the distant bark of a dog. She walked toward the greengrocer's, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt like an intruder in her own life. As she stepped into the shop, the smell of damp earth and ripening fruit hit her, a sensory overload that made her head swim. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a map of kindly wrinkles and sharp curiosity, was behind the counter, weighing a bag of potatoes. She looked up, her eyes widening as they landed on Elara. The silence that followed was brief, but it felt like an eternity. Elara braced herself for the pity, the hushed tones, the inevitable questions. "Mrs. Vance," Mrs. Gable said, her voice surprisingly matter-of-fact. "Lovely to see you out. The strawberries are particularly good today. Just came in from the farm at Little Rissington." Elara blinked, the tension in her shoulders beginning to dissipate. "Strawberries," she repeated, the word feeling sweet on her tongue. "Yes, I'd like some of those, please." As Mrs. Gable nestled the red, fragrant fruit into a paper punnet, she chatted about the weather and the upcoming village fete. She spoke to Elara as if she were a regular customer, a neighbour, a person who existed in the present tense. It was a gift of extraordinary proportions. Elara left the shop with her punnet of strawberries, her footsteps feeling lighter. She walked past the post office, past the pub where the smell of hops and wood smoke drifted from the open door, and found herself in front of the small bookshop on the corner. She hesitated at the door. Books had been Arthur's domain. The house was full of them, their spines cracked, their margins filled with his neat, scholarly hand. To enter a bookshop was to invite him back in, to face the intellectual ghost of him. But as she looked through the window, she saw a display of gardening books, bright, glossy covers featuring roses and peonies and lush, sprawling landscapes. She pushed the door open. The bell gave a cheerful ting. The shop was a labyrinth of paper and ink, the air cool and smelling of old glue. She wandered the aisles, her fingers trailing over the spines. She found herself in the natural world section, her eyes scanning the titles until they landed on a slim volume, The Language of the Soil. She took it from the shelf. It was a practical book, filled with diagrams of root systems and explanations of pH levels. It was a book about the foundation of things, about what happened beneath the surface. She thought of Julian's hands, stained with that very soil, and she realized she wanted to understand what he understood. She wanted to know why things grew, and why they died, and how the two were inextricably linked. As she stood at the counter to pay, the young woman behind the till smiled at her, starting a garden. Then, in a way, Elara replied, her voice soft, I think I'm trying to understand the one I already have. Walking back up the hill toward Blackwood Rise, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, Elara felt a strange sense of equilibrium. The ice hadn't just melted, it had turned into something she could use. She wasn't the woman she had been before Arthur died, but she was no longer the woman who had been buried with him. She was something in between, a landscape in the midst of a seasonal shift. She reached the gates of her estate and paused. The house looked different in the evening light. The grey flint was warm, reflecting the orange and violet of the sky. The windows, once like blind eyes, now held the reflection of the world outside. She saw Julian near the shed, packing away his tools. He looked up as she approached, his gaze moving to the paper bag in her hand and the book tucked under her arm. He didn't say anything, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps. The lavender looks better, he said, nodding toward the path. It'll bloom well next month. Thank you, Julian, she said, and she meant it for more than the gardening. He touched the brim of his cap and began the walk down the drive toward his own life. Elara watched him go until he was a mere speck against the darkening hills. She went inside and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She opened the window wide, letting the night air fill the room. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the book she had bought. The first line read, "To understand the flower, one must first respect the dark from which it grew." She closed her eyes, listening to the wind in the lime trees. It was a summer wind, warm and persistent, carrying the scent of 1,000 growing things. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to pull the blankets up to her chin. She simply sat there in the fading light, her heart beating in time with the world outside, waiting for the morning to come, knowing that when it did, she would be there to meet it. The grief was still there, it would always be there, a permanent feature of her internal geography, but it was no longer a frozen wasteland. It was a forest, dark and complicated, but full of life. And as she lay down to sleep, she realized that the thaw wasn't about forgetting the winter, it was about learning how to live in the spring. The morning arrived not with a clarion call, but with a soft, persistent grey light that filtered through the lime trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the floorboards of the master bedroom. Elara Sterling lay still for a long moment, watching the dust motes dance in a column of sun. For the first time in 3 years, the silence of the house didn't feel like a vacuum, sucking the air from her lungs. It felt like a canvas vast, empty and waiting. She dressed in old corduroy trousers and a heavy knit jumper, garments she hadn't worn since the winters before Arthur's illness took hold. They smelled faintly of cedar and the passage of time. As she pulled her hair back into a functional knot, she caught her reflection in the gilded mirror. The hollows beneath her cheekbones were still there, the lingering map of her morning, but her eyes held a new, quiet alertness. They were no longer the eyes of a woman looking backward into a blizzard. Downstairs, the kitchen was cool. She made tea, the whistle of the kettle a domestic heartbeat. With the book she had purchased the language of the soil tucked under her arm, she stepped out onto the terrace. The air was crisp, the dew clinging to the stone balustrade like a scattering of diamonds. Julian Vance was already there. He was at the far end of the herbaceous border, his back to her, his movements rhythmic and sure as he turned the earth with a garden fork. There was a primal honesty in the sound of metal meeting stone and clay, a dialogue between man and land that Elara found herself envying. She walked down the stone steps, her boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't turn immediately, but she saw his shoulders shift, acknowledging her presence. When he finally straightened, his face was flushed from the exertion, his brow damp. He looked at the book in her hand, and then at her face. "The soil is heavy here," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the morning air. "Too much clay, it holds onto things water, cold, the past, you have to break it up to let the air in." Elara opened the book to a dog-eared page. "It says here that clay is rich in minerals, but it suffocates the roots if it isn't managed. It needs grit, it needs organic matter." Julian leaned on his fork, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It needs a bit of violence, Mrs. Sterling. You can't be polite with clay, you have to get your hands into it." "I want to help," she said. The words felt momentous, a small flag planted in new territory. Julian looked at her hands, pale, slender, the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime turning pages and pouring tea. He didn't scoff. He simply reached into the pocket of his wax jacket and pulled out a pair of spare leather gloves, aged and stiffened by use. He handed them to her. "Start with the rose beds near the sundial," he directed, pointing toward a neglected corner of the garden where the brambles had begun to weave a suffocating net around the dormant bushes. "Clear the weeds. Don't just snap the heads off. You have to follow the root down to the dark. If you leave a fraction of the bindweed, it'll be back before the moon turns." Elara knelt on the damp earth. The cold seeped through her trousers, a sharp, grounding sensation. She reached into the tangle of green and brown, her fingers finding the thick, rope-like stems of the bindweed. As she pulled, the earth resisted. It was a physical struggle, a tug-of-war with the history of the garden. Her mind, usually a whirlpool of what-ifs and if-onlys, began to steady. With every weed she extracted, a layer of her own internal clutter seemed to vanish. She thought of Arthur's study, still preserved in its state of academic arrest. She thought of the way he had curated their life, the precise edges, the lack of mess, the way he had categorized his love for her as if it were a rare specimen in a glass jar. He had loved her, she knew that, but it had been a controlled, intellectual love. It hadn't allowed for the wildness of the soil, the unpredictability of the seasons. By mid-morning, her back ached and her fingernails were stained despite the gloves. She sat back on her heels, surveying the small patch of cleared ground. It looked raw and exposed, but for the first time, she could see the structure of the rose bushes. They were scarred and gnarled, but they were there. "You've a good eye for the root," Julian said, appearing beside her with 2 mugs of steaming tea. He handed her one, his fingers grazing hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated reality through her. They sat on the stone bench by the sundial, the silence between them comfortable, filled only by the distant call of a wood pigeon and the rustle of the wind in the yew hedges. "Why do you do it, Julian?" she asked, her voice soft. "The garden, it's a never-ending battle. You fix one thing, and another breaks. You plant, and the frost kills. Why give your life to something so precarious?" Julian looked out over the rolling hills of the estate, his eyes narrowed against the brightening sun. "Because it's the only thing that's true. Mrs. Sterling, people, we talk, we build walls of words, and we hide behind them. We invent reasons for our pain. But the earth doesn't lie if you don't feed it. It won't grow if you don't prune the dead wood. The whole thing rots. There's a mercy in that kind of honesty. It doesn't ask you to be anything other than what you are. Elara looked down at her tea. I think I've been hiding behind walls of words for a very long time. Arthur's words, mostly. A man's shadow can be a cold place to live, Julian said simply. The remark was blunt, perhaps even impertinent, but Elara found no anger in herself. It was the truth. Arthur had been a sun, and she had been a moon, reflecting his light, existing only in his orbit. When the sun had gone out, she had vanished into the dark. I used to think that the ice was my protection, she mused, her internal monologue spilling out into the open air. That if I stayed frozen, nothing else could hurt me. No more loss, no more decay. But I realized yesterday, the ice doesn't just keep the pain out, it keeps the life out too. Julian stood up, dusting the soil from his trousers. The spring is a messy business. It's not all blossoms and bird song. It's the smell of rot turning into food. It's the struggle of the seed breaking its skin. It's painful. In its own way, but it's better than the stillness. He walked back to his fork, leaving her with the dregs of her tea and the weight of his words. Elara stayed on the bench for a long time. She thought about the language of the soil, the minerals, the pH, the grit. She realized that her grief was the clay, and her newfound curiosity was the grit. She needed to mix them, to work them together until the ground of her soul was friable enough to hold something new. She stood up and returned to the roses. She worked until the sun was high, her muscles screaming in a way that felt like a blessing. As she cleared a particularly stubborn patch of ivy, she found something buried in the dirt, a small, rusted trowel, its wooden handle long since rotted away. She held it in her palm, a relic of someone else's labor, someone who had stood in this very spot decades ago, fighting the same battle against the wild. It was a reminder that she was part of a long, unbroken chain of growth and decay. She wasn't an island of tragedy. She was a participant in a grand, messy, beautiful cycle. That afternoon, she did something she hadn't done since the funeral. She entered Arthur's study and opened the heavy velvet curtains. The room was flooded with light, illuminating the layers of dust on his mahogany desk and the thousands of books that lined the walls. She didn't feel the usual surge of panic. Instead, she felt a profound sense of distance. She looked at his neat handwriting on a half-finished manuscript and realized that these were just marks on paper. They weren't him. He wasn't in this room. He wasn't in the churchyard. He was in the way she remembered the smell of his pipe and the way he tucked his hair behind his ear when he was frustrated. But he was also in the silence he had left behind, a silence she was finally beginning to fill with her own voice. She picked up a small pile of his journals and carried them to the window. As she began to read, not with the desperation of a widow seeking a ghost, but with the clarity of a woman seeking her own path, she heard the sound of Julian's mower in the distance. The drone was a steady, comforting hum, the sound of the world being tended to. Elara turned a page, her dirt-stained thumb leaving a dark smudge on the pristine white paper. She didn't wipe it away. It was a mark of the present, a sign that the woman reading the past was firmly rooted in the earth of the now. The summer wind breathed through the open window, carrying the scent of cut grass and the promise of a heat that would, eventually, reach the very center of her heart. The smudge of damp peat against the ivory vellum was a sacrilege Arthur would have abhorred. He had been a man of pristine margins and unbroken spines, a man who curated his life as if it were a rare first edition, sensitive to the light and the oils of human touch. Elara Sterling stared at the dark thumbprint she had left on the page of his 1990 for diary, a jagged, earthy blemish amidst his elegant, sloping script, and felt a sudden, sharp thrill of liberation. It was the first mark she had ever made on his world that was entirely her own. It was not a footnote to his genius or a polite correction in the margin of his life. It was a thumbprint of soil, a signature of the living world imposed upon the dead. She closed the journal, the heavy thud of the cover echoing through the sun-drenched study. For 3 years, this room had been a reliquary, a place where she moved in hushed reverence, terrified that a loud noise might shatter the fragile ghost of him. But as the summer wind billowed the velvet curtains, carrying the sharp, medicinal scent of crushed yarrow and the dry heat of the Gloucestershire afternoon, the ghost seemed to thin, turning into nothing more than dust motes dancing in the light. Elara stood and walked to the mahogany desk. She did not see a master's workspace anymore. She saw a graveyard of unfinished thoughts. She reached out and touched the cold brass of the lamp, then the silvering quell, and finally the stacks of correspondence from Oxford and London. They were heavy with the weight of a man who had been defined by what he knew, rather than what he felt. "I am not a moon, Arthur," she whispered, her voice sounding strange and resonant in the quiet room. "I am not a reflection." She left the study, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that didn't feel like a betrayal, but an acquittal. Outside, the heat was a physical weight, a golden mantle draped over the rolling hills of Whitewood under edge. The air shimmered over the stone walls of the manor, and the cicadas in the long grass of the paddock were beginning their rhythmic, electric hum. She found Julian Thorne near the old potting shed, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his skin bronzed and mapped with the fine white lines of old scars. He was sharpening a pair of shears, the rhythmic scritch hiss of metal on stone providing a heartbeat to the afternoon stillness. He didn't look up as she approached, but she saw the slight tilt of his head, an acknowledgement of her presence in the vibration of the air. "The study is open," she said, stopping a few feet away. Julian paused, the stone held mid-stroke. He looked at her, his hazel eyes squinting against the glare of the Cotswold sun. "Is it?" "The windows, the doors, all of it. I think I might turn it into a conservatory, for the delicate things, the things that need the light." Julian nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The books won't like the humidity. They'll swell, the bindings will crack." "Let them," Elara said, and the words felt like honey on her tongue. "I'd rather have the smell of damp earth than the smell of old paper. I've spent enough time living in a library of someone else's memories." She walked over to the workbench and picked up the rusted trowel she had found earlier. She had scrubbed it clean, though the pits in the metal remained, tiny craters of history. "Julian, show me how to divide the perennials, the ones that have grown too large for their space, the ones that are choking themselves." He set down the shears and stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the gravel path. "It's a violent business, division. You have to take a spade to the heart of the root ball. You have to tear them apart so they can breathe again. Most people find it hard to watch." "I'm not most people anymore," Elara replied. They spent the next 3 hours in the shadow of the great cedar tree. It was a silent, sacred labor. Julian showed her how to lift the heavy clumps of hostas and hardy geraniums, how to find the natural points of separation, and where to strike with the sharp edge of the spade. She felt the jar of the impact travel up her arms, a blunt, honest vibration that anchored her to the present moment. Each time a root system parted, she felt a strange echo within her own chest, a loosening of the tight, frozen knot that had been her heart for so long. The ice was not melting into water, it was being tilled into the soil. It was becoming part of the texture of her new life, a necessary irrigation for the seeds she had yet to plant. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges, the heat didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to settle, becoming more intimate, more pervasive. The summer wind Julian had spoken of intensified, a warm, pulsing breath that stirred the heavy heads of the roses and sent the scent of lavender cascading over the terrace. Elara wiped her brow with the back of a muddy hand, looking down at the rows of newly divided plants, each with its own space to grow, its own patch of earth to claim. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but it was a clean, holy tiredness. "You've got the grit in you, Mrs. Sterling," Julian said softly, leaning against the stone wall. He wasn't looking at her, but at the horizon, where the first stars were beginning to prick through the violet veil of the evening. "The soil took to you. That's not something you can learn from a book. It's the honesty of it, Julian," she said, her internal monologue finally finding its way into the world without hesitation. "The way the garden doesn't care who I was, or who Arthur was, it only cares about the water and the light. It's the first time I've felt seen, not for my name or my grief, but for the work of my hands." Julian turned to her then, for a moment, the distance between them, the distance of class, of history, of shared silence seemed to vanish. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was like the earth itself, rough, warm, and unapologetically real. "The summer is long," he whispered, "and the heat it goes deep if you let it." He turned and walked toward the gate, his boots crunching on the gravel until the sound faded into the evening chorus of the birds. Elara stood alone in the center of her garden. The wind caught her hair, wrapping around her like a living thing. She closed her eyes and inhaled, filling her lungs with the scent of the turning earth and the ripening fruit. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a void, it felt like a canvas. She looked at her hands, stained dark with the lifeblood of the garden. She thought of the ice that had once encased her soul, the beautiful, sterile prison of her mourning. It was gone. In its place was a raw, aching vitality. The heat of the summer wind pressed against her skin, a golden tide that refused to be turned back. It reached into the hollows of her collarbones, the arches of her feet, and finally, with a soft, rhythmic pulse, it reached the very center of her heart. She wasn't a moon reflecting a dead sun. She was the earth itself, ancient and new, breaking open to the sky. Elara Sterling turned toward the house, not to retreat, but to begin. The shadows were long, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. She knew what lay beneath it, waiting for the spring. She knew the language of the soil now, and she finally had the words to speak her own name.